The candles were burning too low. That was the first thing I noticed when I walked into the grand hall that evening. Not the dignitaries in their pressed suits. Not the long tables draped in white linen that cost more than my monthly rent. Not even the guards stationed at every door like stone pillars pretending to breathe. It was the candles. 3 of them on the east side of the room had melted past the silver holders, wax pooling silently onto the tablecloth, ignored by everyone who mattered. I was the kind of person who noticed things no one else bothered to see. My name is Lucy Callahan, and on the night everything changed, I was 23 years old, invisible by profession, and carrying a tray of crystal glasses that cost more than my car. The summit of Pax, that was what they called it. Once every 5 years, the alpha leaders of the 12 northern territories gathered in neutral ground to negotiate borders, trade routes, and whatever unspoken dominance games wolves liked to play when they weren't actively tearing each other apart. The Ashford estate had been chosen as the hosting ground this year, which meant the catering company I worked for had been contracted for the weekend, which meant I'd been handed a pressed black uniform, a pair of shoes that pinched my toes, and a strict list of instructions about where to look, which was down, and where not to look, which was everywhere else. I was good at looking down. I'd had years of practice. The hall was filling when I arrived at my station, the Western Service corridor that fed directly into the main dining room. Around me, the other servers moved in practiced silence, pouring, adjusting, disappearing into the background the way good staff were trained to do. I tucked a loose strand of blonde hair back behind my ear and picked up my tray. "Careful with the Ashford table," said Marin, one of the senior waitresses, passing me with a loaded cart. She was older, efficient, and had worked 3 of these summits before. "That's the Alpha King's seating. You don't make eye contact, you don't linger, and you don't speak unless spoken to. Understood?" "Understood," I said. She gave me a look that said she didn't quite believe me, then disappeared through the swinging door. I'd heard of Lucian Voss the way most people heard of weather phenomena. Not directly, but through the way everyone around them changed when they knew it was coming. He was the Alpha King, the sovereign of the High Pack, the authority above all 12 territories. His word wasn't law because it was written somewhere. It was law because everyone was too afraid to argue. Even humans, even those of us who existed on the outer rim of the supernatural world as service staff and contract workers, knew the name. I was not afraid of him exactly. I was afraid of everything in a quiet, manageable way that I'd learned to function around. Crowds, loud voices, the particular silence that precedes a very bad decision. The dining room opened at 7. By 7:15, the Alpha King had not yet taken his seat, but his place was already marked. The high-backed chair at the center of the main table, slightly elevated, surrounded by advisors and secondary alphas who kept glancing at the entrance, like they expected the air itself to shift when he walked in. It did. I felt it before I saw him. A change in pressure. Almost. A collective stillness that moved through the room like a held breath. The servers near the main entrance stepped back. Conversation dropped by half. And then Lucian Voss walked through the door, and I understood why. He was tall in the way that made architecture look deliberate around him. Dark hair, jaw set like he'd decided something, and wasn't interested in revisiting the decision. He wore a charcoal suit with no tie, collar open, as if formality had offered itself to him and he'd declined. Around him moved 4 guards and 2 advisors, but none of them pulled attention. He did, effortlessly, the way a deep sound carries farther than a high one. I looked down at my tray. I had 6 glasses to deliver to the eastern tables, a task that would not bring me anywhere near the Alpha King's seat. I told myself this was fortunate. 40 minutes passed. The appetizers were served and cleared. I moved between the tables with practiced efficiency, refilling water, removing plates, keeping my steps light and my presence invisible. The western corridor was my territory, and I worked it well. It was during the second course that I noticed the glasses. I'd been moving toward the service station when I caught something. A smell, faint but distinct. underneath the layered scents of food and wine and expensive cologne. It wasn't anything I could name exactly. Something chemical. Something that didn't belong. I stopped. The glasses for the Alpha King's table had been set out earlier, filled during the pre-service preparation. They sat on the silver tray at the edge of the service station, waiting to be carried to the head table by whichever server had been assigned there tonight, a young man named David, who was currently helping with a spill near table 4. I set my own tray down. I looked at the glasses. One of them was wrong. I couldn't explain how I knew. The color was the same, the fill level identical to the others, but the smell, underneath everything else, faint and almost hidden, was wrong. Like something mineral and too cold, something that didn't belong in wine. I had no training in poison. I had no reason to trust the instinct. I was a waitress at a supernatural summit, a human woman who noticed things like low candles and out-of-place smells, and the thought forming in my mind was so enormous that I almost talked myself out of it in the space of 3 seconds. The glass on the left. The one positioned exactly where the Alpha King would sit. I picked up the tray. I walked to the back counter, set the tray down, and in one quiet motion, lifted the wrong glass and replaced it with a clean one from the sealed storage shelf behind me. My hands were steady. My breathing was not. I put the original glass carefully, very carefully, into the discard bin under the counter, the one used for broken or contaminated items. Not the trash. The discard bin, where management would review everything at the end of the night. Then I picked up the tray and carried it to David, who had returned from the spill. "Your table," I said, and handed it to him. He took it without looking at me. No one had seen what I'd done. The exchange had lasted maybe 40 seconds, occurring in the back service corridor, while the dining room hummed with conversation and the soft sound of chamber music. I returned to my station. My heart was hitting my ribs so hard I was certain someone nearby could hear it. I folded a cloth napkin into thirds, unfolded it, folded it again. I thought about what I had just done, what I might have imagined, what I might have saved, what I might have invented in a moment of nervous exhaustion after a 12-hour shift. I thought, maybe I was wrong. I thought, I hope I was wrong. David carried the tray into the dining room. I watched through the slim window of the swinging door as he set the glasses on the Alpha King's table. The clean glass now, in the correct position. Lucian Voss sat down. He reached for the glass. He did not drink immediately. He was talking to the advisor on his right, one hand resting on the table near the stem but not lifting it. Someone made a toast. The secondary alphas raised their glasses. The Alpha King raised his. And across the room, through the narrow rectangle of the service window, I watched his eyes move. Not to the glass, not to his advisor, not to the toast being made in his honor. They moved to me. I stepped back from the window. He couldn't have seen me. The corridor was dim, the door partially obscured, the distance too great. I was invisible. I was always invisible. But the impression stayed. That dark gaze, landing with precision in the exact place I was standing, as if he had known I was there all along. I pressed my back against the wall of the service corridor and closed my eyes. The candles on the east side were still burning too low. Somewhere in the dining room, someone laughed at a joke I couldn't hear. The chamber music shifted to a slower piece, something in a minor key that felt, in that moment, entirely too appropriate. I didn't know what I had done. I didn't know if it had mattered. But my hands, when I finally looked at them, were still shaking. I didn't sleep that night. The shift ended at midnight, and I took the staff shuttle back to the small inn where the catering company had arranged rooms for the weekend crew. Myron sat 2 seats ahead of me, already half asleep against the window. David had his earphones in. The others talked quietly among themselves about sore feet and difficult guests, and whether the kitchen had saved any of the leftover desserts. No one talked about the glasses. I stared at the dark road moving beneath us, and turned the evening over in my mind the way you turn a stone. looking for the part that would make sense if you just found the right angle. The smell had been real. I was certain of that. I had spent enough hours in cramped kitchens and storage rooms to know the difference between wine that had turned and something that had been introduced deliberately. This had been deliberate, controlled, hidden under the surface like a current beneath still water. What I was less certain about was what came next. I had not told anyone. I had not gone to the event coordinator, had not flagged a supervisor, had not pulled one of those stone-still guards aside and said quietly, "I think someone tampered with the Alpha King's glass." The thought had occurred to me. Of course it had. But the other thoughts had arrived faster. Who would believe me, a contracted human waitress with no credentials and no standing in a room full of supernatural power? I would be dismissed before I finished the sentence. Or worse, I would be considered a suspect. Or worse still, the person who had done it would find out that someone had noticed. So I had said nothing. I had simply removed the problem and walked away, which was, I realized, somewhere between the inn and sleep, exactly the kind of decision that tends to follow a person for a long time afterward. The next morning arrived gray and damp, fog sitting low over the estate grounds. I dressed in my uniform and went to the morning briefing, where the event coordinator, a brisk woman named Helen, reviewed the day's schedule. The summit would continue through 2 more days, a formal lunch, a territorial council session in the afternoon, and a closing banquet on Sunday evening. The catering staff had specific assignments for each. Mine had changed. Lucy. Helen glanced at her clipboard without looking up. "You've been reassigned to the main hall interior for today's lunch service. Section A. That's the central tables." I kept my expression neutral. The central tables. Yes. A request came through this morning from the coordination office. She moved on before I could ask anything else, and I was left standing with the information settling over me like the fog outside. The central tables. The Alpha Kings section. I told myself it was coincidence. Reassignments happened. Staffing changed based on availability, on performance, on 100 administrative reasons that had nothing to do with the glass exchanged in a back corridor the previous night. I told myself this with great conviction all the way through the morning setup, right up until I was arranging place settings at the head table and looked up to find one of the Alpha King's advisors standing 3 feet away, watching me with the particular stillness of someone who had been watching for longer than they'd admitted. He was older, silver-haired, with the kind of face that had learned long ago to reveal nothing. He wore a gray suit and held a tablet loosely in one hand. "Lucy Callahan," he said, not a question. "Yes," I said. "My name is Rendell. I serve as senior advisor to the Alpha King." He paused just long enough to be deliberate. "There is a matter we'd like to discuss with you before the lunch service begins, if you'll follow me." I set down the fork I was holding. My pulse had decided to be unhelpful about this. "Am I in trouble?" I asked, because I had always been better at asking the direct question than pretending I hadn't thought of it. Rendell's expression shifted. Not quite a smile, but something adjacent. "No," he said. "You are not in trouble." He led me out of the main hall and through a corridor I hadn't used before, one that clearly served the private wing of the estate. The carpet here was darker, the walls lined with something that absorbed sound. We stopped at a set of double doors, and Rendell knocked twice. "Come in," said a voice. I recognized it without having heard it before. Some voices carry authority the way some rooms carry cold, not because of volume or sharpness, but because something in the frequency tells your nervous system to pay attention. I followed Rendell inside. The room was a private study. Bookshelves, a wide window overlooking the fog-covered grounds, a fireplace with a low flame. Lucien Voss was standing at the window, with his back partially turned, a coffee cup in one hand, looking like someone who had already been awake for several hours and had used that time productively. He turned when we entered. Up close, he was even harder to look at directly. Not because he was frightening, though the capability for it was evident, but because he was entirely, uncomfortably present. The kind of person who occupies a room rather than simply standing in it. His eyes found me immediately. The same dark gaze from the previous night, except now there was no corridor between us and no dim window to hide behind. He looked at me for a long moment without speaking, and I had the specific, destabilizing sensation of being genuinely seen by someone for the first time in a while. "You were the one," he said. Not a question either, apparently. These people didn't ask many questions. They stated things and waited for the world to confirm or deny. "I don't know what you mean," I said, which was not my best effort, and we both knew it. Something moved at the corner of his mouth. "The glass. Last night." I said nothing. "The original glass," he continued, setting his coffee cup down on the desk, "was recovered from the discard bin during the post-event review. My security team analyzed it this morning." A pause. "You already know what they found." The fire crackled. Outside, the fog pressed against the window. "I wasn't certain," I said finally. "I thought I might have imagined it." The smell was faint. "You weren't certain," he repeated, and there was something in his voice. Not quite disbelief, not quite the opposite. "But you changed the glass anyway." I didn't want to be wrong and do nothing. The room was quiet for a moment. Rendell had stepped back near the door, giving the space to the conversation without leaving it. Lucian Voss looked at me with an expression I couldn't fully read. Not gratitude exactly, because I suspected gratitude was not an emotion he deployed quickly, but something more careful. Something that was still deciding what it was. "Why didn't you report it?" he asked. Who would have believed me? He didn't answer immediately, which I took to mean he understood the question. "You're human," he said. "Yes." "You work a contracted catering shift." "Yes." "And you noticed something that my own security team, with full equipment and protocol, missed entirely until after the fact." He said this without any particular inflection, as if he were reading aloud a fact he was still processing. Then he looked at me differently, with a focus that was sharp and unhurried at once. The kind of attention that feels less like being examined and more like being considered. "What's your name?" "You already said my name," I pointed out. "Rendell told you." This time the corner of his mouth did move. "I know your name. I'm asking you to tell me." I understood then that it was not a question about information. It was something else, an opening, or a test, or both. "Lucy," I said. "Lucy Callahan. Lucy." He said it once, quietly, as if filing it somewhere specific. Then he straightened and looked toward Rendell. "Arrange an extension of her contract through the close of the summit. Full security clearance for the interior sections." Rendell nodded and made a note without comment. Lucian looked back at me. "You'll continue your work. But from now on, your station is Section A." "Near your table," I said. "Near my table," he confirmed. And then, as if the conversation had a weight he was setting down carefully rather than dropping, "You took a considerable risk last night, without knowing whether anyone would ever know, or whether it would matter. That tells me something." I didn't ask what it told him. I wasn't sure I was ready for the answer. He turned back toward the window, and I understood that I was being dismissed. Not unkindly, but definitely. The fog outside had begun to thin at the edges, pale light starting to push through in uneven patches. I left the room. In the corridor, I stood for a moment with my back against the wall. A habit, apparently, that I was developing around this particular situation. My hands were not shaking this time. That felt like something. The lunch service passed without incident, which was either a relief or a different kind of tension, the kind that comes from waiting for something to happen and having it not happen yet. I worked Section A with the same quiet efficiency I brought to every shift, moving between the tables with my tray and my eyes appropriately lowered, refilling glasses, clearing plates, existing in the precise margin between visible enough to be useful and invisible enough to be ignored. The difference was that now I was paying attention in a way I hadn't been before. Not just to smells or out-of-place details, but to the room itself, the architecture of power arranged around the central table, the way certain conversations stopped when others leaned in, the small gravitational system of alliances and tensions that organized itself around Lucian Voss, the way planets organize around something too large to argue with. He was a careful man. That was the thing I noticed most. Not cold, the way I'd expected. Not the theatrical distance that powerful people sometimes perform to remind others of the gap. He listened when his advisors spoke. He watched the other alphas with the particular attention of someone who had learned that information lives in the spaces between what people say. When one of the territorial leaders, a broad-shouldered man introduced as Alpha Darren of the Westfall Pack, made a joke at the expense of a smaller delegation, Lucian's expression didn't change, but his hand moved, just slightly, and the conversation shifted. No one acknowledged it. No one was supposed to. That was how that kind of authority worked. I collected empty glasses and told myself I wasn't watching him. By early afternoon, the council session had pulled most of the senior figures into the estate's formal meeting room, leaving the dining hall quieter and the remaining staff moving through cleanup rotations. I was restocking the Eastern Service Station when Marin appeared beside me. "You've been reassigned to A section," she said. It wasn't an accusation. It was the tone of someone locating a fact they hadn't known where to put. "Helen told me this morning," I said. Marin was quiet for a moment, stacking linen napkins with the focus of someone thinking about something else. She was in her mid-40s, had worked catering events for supernatural gatherings for longer than I'd been in the industry, and had the kind of composure that comes not from lack of feeling, but from long practice at directing it. "Be careful," she said finally. "I'm always careful. That's not what I mean." She set the last napkin down and looked at me directly, which Marin didn't often do. "These summits, the politics here are older than anything you can read about. The alphas who come to these tables have histories with each other that go back generations. Whatever's happening around that center table right now has roots we can't see from where we're standing." She paused. People who get pulled into those roots don't always find their way back out. I thought about what to say. I thought about the glass in the discard bin and the fog-covered window, and a voice saying you took a considerable risk. "I hear you," I said. She nodded once and moved away, and I was left with her warning sitting alongside everything else I was already carrying. The afternoon moved slowly. I finished my rotation, helped with the linen restock, and was heading toward the staff break room when one of the Alpha King's guards appeared at the corridor entrance. Not one of the stationed ones. A younger man, compact and alert, who walked with the specific purposefulness of someone on a directed errand. "Callahan," he said. I stopped. "Yes." "The Alpha King requests your presence at the East Terrace, when your current duties allow." I looked at the empty hallway around me. "My current duties are done." A brief pause. Then now would be appropriate. The East Terrace was accessed through a side door I hadn't used before, and it opened onto a stone-paved platform overlooking the estate's rear grounds. A wide stretch of formal garden giving way to tree line, the afternoon light finally breaking through in earnest, pulling long gold shapes across the stone. The fog had cleared completely, and the air smelled like cold grass and something faintly resinous from the pines. Lucian Voss was standing at the terrace railing, alone. No advisors. No guards within visible range. He had changed out of the morning's formal jacket into something simpler. Dark, fitted, sleeves pushed back slightly in a way that made him look less like a summit figurehead and more like a person who had needed, briefly, to stop performing. He turned when I approached. "You don't have to look at the floor when you're not in the dining room," he said. I lifted my gaze. Force of habit. I noticed. He said it without criticism, which somehow made it land differently than criticism would have. He turned back toward the garden, and after a moment I moved to stand a few feet down the railing, not beside him exactly, but in the same direction. The garden below was immaculate. Stone pathways, geometric hedges, dormant flower beds waiting for a season that hadn't arrived yet. There was something austere about its beauty, like it had been designed to impress, rather than to be enjoyed. The analysis came back fully confirmed, Lucian said. He wasn't looking at me. What was in that glass would have been effective within 40 minutes of consumption, designed to appear natural. A pause. Whoever placed it had access to the pre-service preparation area, knowledge of the seating arrangement, and enough familiarity with summit protocol to move without drawing attention. I processed this. Someone on staff. Someone with access to the staff, not necessarily staff themselves. He was quiet for a moment. My security team is working through the possibilities. What I want to understand is how you detected it when they did not. I considered the question carefully. I don't know if I can explain it well. I've worked a lot of service shifts in a lot of different environments. You start to build a kind of map, I suppose, of how things should smell, how they should look. When something is out of place, it doesn't always announce itself. It just sits wrong. A map, he repeated, something in his tone suggesting he was storing the word specifically. I grew up in a house where paying attention to small things mattered, I said, and then stopped, because that was more than I'd intended to offer. He turned to look at me then, and I found that looking back was easier out here than it had been in the study, the open air helping somehow, the absence of walls. What kind of house? He asked. It wasn't a casual question. He asked it the way he did everything, with full attention, without pretending to be only half interested. A complicated one, I said. He accepted that without pushing, which I hadn't expected. He turned back to the garden. We stood in silence for a while, and it was not an uncomfortable silence. It was the kind that exists between people who are both thinking and have decided to let the thinking happen without filling it with noise. I had not stood in that kind of silence with another person in a long time. I hadn't realized I'd missed it. There are 3 more people at this summit, Lucian said eventually, who had the combination of access and knowledge required. My team will confirm or eliminate each of them before the closing banquet. He paused. In the meantime, I intend to continue the summit as scheduled. Canceling would signal vulnerability. That seems like a significant risk, I said. It is. No hesitation. But retreating from a threat that hasn't fully revealed itself only teaches the threat to hide better. I thought about that. It had the quality of something learned from experience rather than strategy texts. I'll be at the closing banquet, I said. Section A. He looked at me again, and this time there was something in it that I couldn't quite name. A recognition, maybe, or the early edge of one. I know, he said. Below us, the garden held its geometric shapes against the fading afternoon light, and somewhere in the tree line a bird called once and went quiet. I didn't ask him what came next. He didn't tell me. But when I turned to go back inside, I was aware of him watching me leave. Not in a way that felt like surveillance, but in a way that felt like someone watching something they have not yet decided what to do with. That night, for the first time since the summit began, the other servers at dinner were chatty and relaxed, talking about the weekend's end and what they'd do with their pay. I sat with my soup and listened and said very little, and thought about stone terraces and complicated houses and the precise shape of a silence shared with someone who doesn't pretend to be less than they are. I slept, finally. Briefly, but fully. Marin's warning stayed in the back of my mind like a candle left burning in another room, present, casting just enough light to remind me it was there. Sunday arrived with clear skies and a cold that had teeth in it. I was at the estate by 7 a.m, earlier than required, because I had not been able to stay in the inn room with my own thoughts any longer. The grounds were quiet at that hour, the security rotation visible but unhurried, the kitchen staff already deep into preparation for the closing banquet. I helped with the early setup without being asked, arranging centerpieces, checking glass inventory, walking the room in the particular way I had developed over the weekend, mapping it the way I mapped every space I worked in, looking for things that sat wrong. Everything looked right. That made me more careful, not less. By mid-morning, the tension inside the estate had shifted in a way that was difficult to articulate but impossible to ignore. The secondary alphas moved through the corridors in tighter clusters. Conversations happened closer to walls. Rendell had not appeared at breakfast, which several of the staff noted because he was typically the first person in the dining room, clipboard in hand, reviewing the day's logistics with the precision of someone who considered disorder a personal offense. I noticed his absence. I filed it. Around 11, I was in the service corridor restocking when I heard voices through the thin partition wall. Two of the estate's permanent staff, speaking in the low, rapid register of people who think they're not being overheard. Pulled in for questioning this morning. One of the summit's external coordinators. Do they know yet who? Rendell's handling it. But there's a second name. That's what I heard. 2 people. The voices moved away. I stood very still with a stack of folded napkins in my hands and let the information settle into the map I'd been building all weekend. 2 people. A coordinator with access to the pre-service area, and a second name still unconfirmed. The closing banquet was 6 hours away. I finished my restocking and went to find Helen. She was in the event office, surrounded by seating charts and a controlled expression that suggested the weekend had been more complicated than anticipated. I knocked on the open door. Lucy, what do you need? A question, I said. The pre-service glass preparation. Who handles that for tonight? The same process as Friday? Helen looked at me with the focused attention of someone recalibrating. Why? I want to make sure the procedure is documented correctly, for the post-event report. It was thin, and we both knew it, but it was also exactly the kind of procedural language that Helen responded to instinctively. She consulted her clipboard. Tonight's glassware prep is being handled by the kitchen supervisor and 2 of our senior staff. It was moved to an internal process after... She paused, choosing words. A concern was flagged Friday night. Good, I said. That's good. I left before she could ask me anything else. The afternoon passed in the careful rhythm of pre-banquet preparation. I worked steadily, staying inside my section, keeping my movements deliberate and my expression neutral. Around me, the other servers were tired and ready for the weekend to end, moving on the momentum of finality. David was already talking about the drive home, the girl who worked the North Station, whose name I had learned was Petra, had dark circles under her eyes, and smiled at me for the first time all weekend, the smile of 2 people sharing a finishing line. At 4 o'clock, Rendell appeared in the main hall. He looked exactly as composed as always, which I had come to understand meant he was working very hard. He walked the length of the room once, spoke briefly to Helen, and then, without any visible change in direction, as if it were simply the next item on a list, stopped beside me. The Alpha King will speak with you before the banquet, he said quietly. 7 o'clock, the study. Is everything all right? I asked. Rendell looked at me with the expression he used when a question was reasonable, but the answer required more context than was currently available. There have been developments. He'll explain. A pause, deliberate. Lucy, what you did Friday night, it has not gone unnoticed by anyone who's noticing matters. I want you to understand that. He moved on before I could respond. At 7 o'clock, I knocked on the study door. Come in. The room was warmer than it had been Saturday morning. The fire properly built this time, the lamps lit against the early dark pressing at the windows. Lucian was at the desk, actually sitting, which I hadn't seen him do before, reading something on a tablet with the focused frown of a man working through a problem that wasn't resolving cleanly. He set the tablet down when I entered. Sit, he said, and gestured to the chair across the desk. Not commanding. The word was too flat for what it actually was, which was closer to an invitation delivered by someone who didn't entirely remember how those worked. I sat. "We identified both individuals this morning," he said without preamble. "An external events coordinator who was contracted 6 weeks ago, and a member of the Westfall delegation." He paused. Alpha Darren's inner circle, the man who had made the joke at lunch, the broad shoulders and the easy cruelty of someone accustomed to small dominances. "A territorial play," I said. "An old one. Westfall has disputed our northern border for 11 years. Darren calculated that removing me during a summit, surrounded by witnesses, appearing natural, would create a succession crisis significant enough to fracture the High Pack's authority over the disputed land." His voice was even. Clinical, almost. But there was something underneath it, a controlled tension in the line of his jaw that told me the evenness was a choice he was making in real time. "What happens to them?" I asked. "That's being handled." His eyes met mine, and the steadiness in them asked me to trust the answer, without requiring the details. "What I need you to understand is the scope of what you prevented. Not just my life, though I don't intend to be casual about that." Something shifted in his expression then, brief and unguarded. A succession crisis at this summit would have triggered border conflicts in 4 territories. Thousands of people, wolf and human alike, living inside those borders. The fire settled with a soft sound. I thought about 40 seconds in a service corridor, a glass lifted and replaced, hands that wouldn't stop shaking. "I didn't know any of that," I said. "I know." He leaned forward slightly. "That's what makes it extraordinary. You acted on instinct and integrity, without any knowledge of the stakes, without any expectation of recognition, because you didn't want to be wrong and do nothing." He echoed my own words back to me, and hearing them in his voice gave them a weight they hadn't had when I'd said them. I looked at the desk between us, at the tablet and the papers, and the accumulated material of a man managing a weight I couldn't fully see. "You look tired," I said, and then immediately thought about the fact that one did not say that to an Alpha King. But he didn't react with offense. He looked at me with something that was almost surprise, and then something that was almost relief, as if the observation had been a door left slightly open and he hadn't expected anyone to try it. "I am tired," he said, simply, like he hadn't said it out loud in a long time. "The summit ends tonight," I said, "after the banquet." "Yes, and then you go back. To the High Pack territory, yes." He was watching me carefully. "And you? Back to the city, back to shifts." I paused. "I work 3 contracts a month when I can get them. The summit circuit pays better than private dining." Something moved across his face. Not pity, nothing so reductive. More like someone doing a calculation that wasn't strictly numerical. "I want to offer you a position," he said, "at the High Pack estate. Not a catering contract, a permanent role. Household staff with full standing, security clearance, and a proper salary." He paused. "You have a particular skill that my security apparatus has demonstrated it lacks. The ability to notice what isn't right in a room before it becomes a crisis." The fire was warm. Outside, the final night of the summit was assembling itself in the lit windows of the Great Hall. I thought about contracted shifts and in-rooms, and the precise, practiced art of being invisible. I thought about what Marin had said. People who get pulled into those roots don't always find their way back out. And I turned the warning over once more, looking at it honestly. "Can I think about it through the banquet?" I asked. Lucian Voss looked at me, and in the firelight his expression was something I was only beginning to have language for. Not patience exactly, not eagerness, but the particular steadiness of someone willing to wait for something they believe is worth waiting for. "Take the whole evening," he said. The closing banquet was the most beautiful and most exhausting thing I had ever worked. The hall had been transformed over the course of the afternoon. The white linen replaced with deep charcoal and gold. The candles fully replaced this time, burning evenly at every table in tall glass holders that threw warm light across the room in overlapping circles. The floral arrangements were architectural, severe and elegant, and the chamber ensemble had been expanded to a full quartet that played from the corner with the kind of precision that makes music feel inevitable rather than performed. I moved through Section A with my tray and my uniform and my worn shoes, and I noticed everything. I noticed the way the Westfall delegation sat in contained, careful silence, 3 seats shorter than they had been at Friday's dinner. Alpha Darren present but diminished, speaking to no one, looking at the table in front of him with the expression of a man counting the cost of a failed calculation. I noticed that Rendell had returned to his place at Lucian's right hand, and that the 2 men exchanged exactly 4 quiet words at the start of the meal, after which Rendell's posture settled in a way that meant whatever had needed resolving had been resolved. I noticed that Lucian did not look for me immediately when he sat down. He waited until I was at the table, until I was there in the normal course of my work, refilling a water glass 2 seats to his left, and only then did his gaze move to me, briefly, with the economy of someone who has learned not to make their attention obvious. It lasted perhaps 2 seconds. It carried the weight of the entire conversation in the study, of everything said and not said, held in a look and then released. I moved on to the next glass. Myron was working the south section tonight, and at one point during the second course our paths crossed at the service station. She looked at me for a moment, really looked, the way she had the day before, and something in her expression shifted. Not the warning this time. Something quieter. "You seem different," she said. "I've been thinking," I said. "About what?" I considered the question. About a glass exchanged in 40 seconds. About 40 seconds somehow leading to a stone terrace and a firelit study and an offer laid out with the same directness that seemed to be this man's only register. About what it meant to spend years perfecting invisibility and then have someone look directly through it. Not to expose you, but because they could actually see. About what I'm good at, I said. Maren studied me for another moment. Then she nodded, once, with the particular nod of someone who has said what they needed to say and is prepared to trust the outcome. The banquet moved through its courses with the stately pace of events that know they are endings. Toasts were made. Careful, diplomatic, language chosen to paper over whatever fault lines the weekend had revealed without closing them entirely. The Alpha King spoke briefly and without notes, and the room listened the way rooms listen to someone who has never needed volume to command attention. He spoke about the purpose of the summit, about the agreements reached, about the territories and the people inside them. He did not mention what had nearly happened. He did not need to. I stood at my station and listened and thought. This is what it looks like when someone carries something that large and doesn't let it bend them. After the formal proceedings, the banquet loosened into the final social hour. Conversation, movement between tables, the gentle dissolution of formality that marks the last hour of any long gathering. Staff began the early stages of cleanup around the edges of the room. I finished my service rotation and stood near the eastern wall, watching the room in the way I always did at the end of a shift, cataloging it, filing it, preparing to let it go. Rendell appeared beside me. "Have you given it thought?" he asked. "Yes," I said. "And?" I looked across the room. Lucian was standing with a group of 3 alphas, engaged in what appeared to be a genuine exchange rather than a diplomatic performance. Leaning forward slightly, listening, the controlled formality of the summit's public hours set aside for something more direct. As I watched, he said something that made the alpha across from him pause and then laugh. A real laugh, caught off guard, the kind that happens before the filter engages. I had not seen him make anyone laugh before. It rearranged something in the picture I'd been building all weekend. "I'll take the position," I said. Rendell made a note on his tablet with the same expression he used for everything, which was no expression at all, but his voice when he spoke had a warmth in it that I was learning to recognize. "I'll prepare the formal offer for your review tomorrow morning. Compensation, terms, a full outline of the role." He paused. "You'll want to know what you're agreeing to before you agree to it. He'll expect that." "He seems like someone who expects people to read things carefully," I said. "He is," Rendell said. "He also seems like someone who has been waiting a long time for staff who notice what's wrong in a room before it becomes a problem." A pause. "Among other things." He moved away before I could ask what he meant by other things, which I suspected was deliberate. The banquet ended at 11. The formal dismissal was brief. Lucian thanked the host estate, acknowledged the delegations, and the room began its unhurried dispersal. I was helping with the initial table clear when I became aware of him crossing the room toward me, and I had the specific sensation of a moment arriving that I had been circling for 3 days without letting myself name. He stopped a few feet away. The room was still occupied, staff moving, guests departing. But there was a pocket of quiet around him, the way there always was, as if space itself was polite in his vicinity. "Rendell tells me you've decided," he said. "I have." He was quiet for a moment, and in the quiet I could see him choosing between several versions of what to say next. The formal version, the efficient version, the version that a man says when he is trying to stay in the register of professional and practical. I watched him make the choice. "I'm glad," he said, simply, without the armor of formality around it. It was 2 words, plainly delivered, and it landed with a directness that all the elaborate language of the weekend had not managed. "I'm not entirely sure what I'm walking into," I said honestly. "No," he agreed. "But I've found that the people who are certain before they begin are usually the ones least prepared for what actually happens." Something in his expression opened slightly. Not a smile, not yet, but the shape of one considered. "You notice things. You act on what you notice, even when the cost isn't clear. That's not a small thing, Lucy. That's the thing." I looked at him in the warm, diminishing light of the hall, at the controlled tiredness in his face, and the steadiness underneath it. And I thought about all the years of looking down and moving quietly, and being the person in the room that no one saw. I thought, I don't want to be invisible anymore, not to him, not in this. "Then I'll see you tomorrow," I said, "when Rendell has the paperwork." "Tomorrow," he confirmed. I turned back to the table I'd been clearing, and this time I did not hear him walk away. I simply became aware, gradually, that the particular quality of attention in the room had shifted, which meant he had moved on, which meant the moment had completed itself in the way that real moments do. Without flourish, without announcement, with only the quiet certainty that something had changed and would not change back. The cleanup took another hour. I worked alongside Marin and Petra and David, and we talked about small things. The drive home, the weekend's pay, whether the leftover desserts had survived. And I let the conversation wash over me like the end of something earned. When I finally walked out of the Ashford estate at midnight, the grounds were quiet, and the sky had come fully clear, stars hard and bright above the tree line. The cold had deepened, and I could see my breath in small clouds ahead of me. I stood for a moment at the top of the staff entrance steps, not thinking about anything in particular, just standing in the night air, in the end of the weekend, in the beginning of whatever came next. Marin came through the door behind me, pulling on her coat. She stood beside me for a moment, following my gaze toward the tree line without comment. Then she said, "Be careful, but don't let careful become a reason not to go." I looked at her. She was already buttoning her coat, already moving toward the shuttle, already done saying what she'd decided to say. In the weeks that followed, I signed the contract. I moved. I learned the structure of the High Pack estate, its protocols and its people, its rhythms and its silences. I learned that Rendell drank his coffee without anything in it, and considered this a point of personal discipline. I learned that the estate's head of security, A woman named Oren, with a dry humor and a memory like a legal document, tested every new staff member for the first month by leaving small inconsistencies around the building to see what they noticed. I noticed all of them. Oren and I understood each other well after that. I learned that Lucian worked late and ate breakfast early, and occasionally stood on the East Terrace in the gray morning hours with coffee and no particular expression, and that on those mornings he was not performing anything for anyone, and that those were the moments when the weight he carried was most visible and also, somehow, most human. I learned that trust, for people who have learned to be careful with it, is given slowly and in pieces, and that this is not a flaw, but a kind of integrity. And I learned, over months that moved in the particular rhythm of a life being quietly rebuilt from the inside out, that the best thing I had ever done, not just on the night in question, but in my life broadly, was to be the kind of person who didn't want to be wrong and do nothing. The 12 territories settled into a cautious stability after the summit. The Westfall matter was resolved through channels I was not fully briefed on, but the outcome was evident in the absence of further tension along the northern border. Alpha Darren stepped down from his position 6 months later, a decision announced quietly and accepted without public comment. Rendell told me, once, that some endings are cleaner when no one has to make a speech about them. I thought he was right. Oren was promoted to Chief of Security at the end of the year. She told me at her small, practical celebration dinner, attended by 8 people and catered, with some irony, by the same company I had worked for, that she had recommended me for a formal advisory role in the estate's safety protocols. I told her I would think about it carefully before agreeing. She said she would have been worried if I hadn't said that. Maren retired from the summit circuit that winter. She sent me a short message when she heard where I'd ended up, which said only, "Good. Now stop looking at the floor." I read it 3 times, and Lucian, the Alpha King, the man who had stood at a terrace railing with his sleeves pushed back, and admitted simply that he was tired, learned, in the way that careful people learn things, slowly and without announcement, that the woman who had changed a glass in 40 seconds without anyone watching was someone worth watching. Not as a curiosity, not as a security asset, not as a story he told about the summit. As someone he wanted in the room, in the meetings, in the mornings, in the quiet that existed between 2 people who had both spent too long being alone in the particular way that has nothing to do with whether others are present. On a cold evening near the end of that first year, standing on the East Terrace with the pine-scented air and the hard winter stars, he told me that he had known, in the study on Sunday morning, that something had shifted. That he had spent the rest of the summit trying to determine what to do with that knowledge, and had landed, finally, on the oldest answer. Tell the truth and see what happens. I told him that was a considerable risk for someone with a kingdom to protect. He said, "I've found that the things worth protecting are usually the things worth risking something for." I thought about 40 seconds, about the glass, and the shaking hands, and all the years of looking down. I looked up.